not sufficient guidance to faculty to encourage them to change practice.
Okay, Bobby, maybe if you just move on to the next one.
Okay, so my research question was, what is the current practice in the construction of rubrics to assess online discussions? So I was trying to find out the sort of quality, the standards that are used, the commonality, if any, of the rubrics that are in current use. So I had been reading about 50, 60, 70 papers for a much larger project, and about 20 of those papers provided examples of rubrics, and I got a little distracted by that. And I took those 20 rubrics and began an analysis of, and it's really the results of that analysis I'm reporting on today. So it wasn't really the purpose of the research, but I did find it interesting. So what I did was I extracted the 20 rubrics in those 50 papers. I discovered that within the 20 rubrics, there were 128 different statements or criteria within those rubrics. I should add that they were not always expressed as criteria. Some rubrics simply had statements within them. Technically wrong, a rubric should technically have criteria and not a statement. However, I came up with a grand total within those 20 rubrics of 128 statements, which averages around 6.5 statements per rubric. Many of those statements said much the same thing in a slightly different way. I've got examples of that coming up. So although I'm saying that the 20 rubrics had 120 criteria, they didn't really. It was really, you know, a criterion, say a criterion about participation, but there would be 10 or 12 or 20 criteria that were really about participation, but worded in a slightly different way. So my next task was to group the very similar criteria into, you know, one heading. For example, criteria that relates to participation. So that 128 statements became 33 genuinely different criteria. And then my final stage was to categorize those 33 criteria by types. Now the results are coming up, so if you're not entirely clear about my methodology, I think my findings will make the methodology clear. The small print. You can gather from my methodology it was not particularly rigorous. So I'm not making any grand claims about, you know, only looking at 20 rubrics. So the sample size was very small. It wasn't selected in a statistically robust way. It was simply the 20 rubrics that I came across in my literature review. So I'm not making any claims about the generalizability of my findings, nor about the validity or reliability of my findings. Now, if half of you are tempted to log off and do something more interesting now because I'm owning up to quite serious weaknesses in my research, I would say that in spite of the methodological weakness of my approach, I am fairly confident that in spite of that my findings are probably true, because I discovered a pattern in the rubrics very early on. Having looked at half a dozen rubrics, a pattern was emerging and the next 14 simply reinforced that pattern. So I know it's maybe not very professional of me to say this, but while the methodology was weak, I am confident that my findings are probably true. Okay, so my first finding was the way in which the rubrics were actually written. And it may not come as a surprise to many of you to know that the rubrics were expressed in quite varied ways. Some were written as criteria, as they should have been, but some were written as simple statements of performance. And some were written as examples of performance at a particular point. Again, I think there's examples coming up. Very little consistency in terminology. There's an example in the middle of that slide. So, for example, academic standards were expressed as depth of insight or intellectual challenge or quality of knowledge, much thought. All of those criteria, and they are literally quotations from rubrics. They really all meant the same thing, but used quite different language. So there's a problem, I would argue, in the way that rubrics are expressed. Subjective language was common, so words like good and regular and poor and many were used without any further definition, begging the question, what does the author mean by a good contribution or regular contributions? I'm afraid the rubrics were riddled with subjective language like that. And finally, the language varied in formality. Most rubrics were written in fairly formal English, but 2 or 3 were, sort of down there with the students and tried to use almost street language. And there's a sort of quotation at the end there. Your messages didn't leave me jazzed. And that particular rubric was, full of language like that. Yeah. No wonder you're laughing, Gillian. Yeah. I think that same rubric had a criterion, which wasn't a criterion, it was a statement, which is my earlier point, but it said something like, I was sorry that I had to read your contributions. That was one of the benchmarks.